Well, welcome back to Kindness and Truth. I'm Dan Brubaker, and we have a special guest today. It's Jonathan Emord, who is running for the United States Senate.
Yes, sir.
Here in the state of Virginia, and I think you're going to enjoy our conversation. Please do take some time to like and subscribe to the channel, and thank you for being here.
Yes, great pleasure.
It's so nice to have you, and it's been great to get to know you over the past year as we've been in contact through political campaigns and so forth. The first thing that I'd like to do in this conversation is to allow you to introduce yourself. Tell us what you did in the past and what brought you to the point of now running for the United States Senate. What really pushed you into feeling that that was an important thing to do?
Well, I'm a constitutional lawyer, have been for the last 38 years, and came into Washington during the Reagan administration. I was asked to come to work for the Federal Communications Commission right out of law school. I'd started a PhD program when I got the call, and so I would have to leave that program to come to work for the Reagan people. And they asked me, how would you like to work for the FCC, Federal Communications Commission? And I said, well, I don't think the FCC should exist, so why should I go to work for it? And they said, that's exactly why we'd like you to come out.
Yes.
So the Reagan people were interested in deregulation, and they brought me out to Washington to help. I then left the FCC and went to work in the private law practice as a federal litigator against the government, principally. And I gained a name for myself for beating the government. So, you know, as you know, about 98, 99% of the time, the Justice Department wins in its cases. So when I had a string of victories against the Federal Communication or Food and Drug Administration, that caught the attention of people.
Yeah.
And I continued to win against the FDA for a total of 8 cases. And then people started calling me the FDA Dragon Slayer, which I very much liked. But I've also litigated against other agencies too over the years, and I kind of wish they would call me a Dragon Slayer about them as well. But that was my claim to fame, the FDA victories. So, you know, since then, I have written several books. I've also been litigating since then. And I decided a couple of years ago that, you know, interacting with the bureaucracy every day is what I do, essentially. So I'm always interacting with the various agencies. And I've seen a progressive movement, I do use that word intentionally, ever leftward in the administrative state. And in 2008, I think, I wrote my book, The Rise of Tyranny, where I anticipated that if we didn't stop the movement then towards the bureaucracy taking total control, that we would have a situation that would be very perilous for us, incapable of maintaining a republic. At that time,
2008, you said?
2008. And at that time, I said that we had a bureaucratic oligarchy ruling America, which I still believe is true. 3/4 of all federal law is not the product of those we elect, but is the product of the unelected head.
Which is unconstitutional.
It is indeed. And so I sound the you know, alarm bells then in 2008. And many people at that time thought, no, you know, we're all right. Things are going to work out. Yeah, you're right that 3/4 of all federal law is made by the bureaucracy, but that doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. We're going to be able to snap back. We have a pretty strong republic. And I was saying, no, you know, this is a serious problem. We are going in the wrong direction, and we are going there fast. Then in 2021, when within 1 month of, we're actually 1 day of one another, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer announced that if Bernie Sanders were chosen by the Democrat Party, that they would fully endorse him, and that furthermore they would accept his platform. I realized that suddenly the Democrat Party had overtly embraced a socialist agenda for America. And you'll remember at about the same time, many Democrat politicians and individuals who are active in the Democrat Party began to call themselves overtly socialists.
Yes.
And this, I think...
It wasn't too long before when that was, you would act it, but you would not ever embrace that term.
That's right. Yeah. They were embarrassed to refer to themselves as a socialists. And there were, at the time, in 2008, I'd say that the predominant Democrat was a Rooseveltian kind of a Democrat in this sense. They believed in civil liberties, but they didn't believe in a free market economy. They were increasingly skeptical about free market economics. They believed in a regulatory state, but they still favored freedom of speech and believed in civil liberties. That changed dramatically in 2021. Changed pretty much with the Floyd riots. The whole attitude became more militant. And then you saw both on the national...
That was in 2020, I believe.
2020, that's right, preceding this. And in 2021, the apparatus of the Democrat Party pretty much was controlled by radical leftists. And they set the agenda. So this created an urgency for me. I had been talking with Congressman Dan Burton, who is a friend of mine, ever since he had me testify before the House Government Reform and Oversight Committee many years before. Just an aside, I was asked to represent a boy named Zachary McConnell. Zachary had a brain tumor, a glioblastoma. His parents had succeeded in getting him on a clinical trial in Texas with a Dr. Brzezinski, who had this drug called anti-neoplastins. And he was largely ineligible under the protocol to be a participant, but Dr. Brzezinski allowed him in anyway. He received treatments and his brain tumor began to shrink. This is after multiple rounds of chemo and radiation with the boy. Did not work, and he had lost half of his body weight. And he would bang his head against the wall because of the pain he experienced, the pressure he would experience after the radiation treatments. So his parents said, "We can't continue this. This is absolutely barbaric torture, and we don't want our child to die in pain and misery like this." So they got on this clinical trial. Well, the FDA notified Brzezinski that he had to get off the clinical trial because he didn't meet the protocol. He had to be taken off, and they told the parents, "You have to go back to radiation and chemo." So the parents were beside themselves. They contacted me. They asked them, me to help them fight the FDA on this. I contacted Dr. DeLapp, who was then the head of oncology at FDA, for the purpose of getting an exception. He said that no, that an exception wouldn't be allowed, that the boy had evaluated his case and they determined that he would be better put at having radiation and chemo. So Are
these people making these decisions doctors as well?
Yes.
No, so in that case, because sometimes government bureaucrats who are making decisions are not, but in this case they were. In this case it was, and I told him, I said to him, "Look, this is barbaric. This is inhumane." I said, "If this was your own child, I'm sure you would do everything in your power to save your child." And I said, "Here, you're disallowing that for these parents." And I said, "This is not going to stand. We're going to do everything in our power to change it. But I'm giving you one last chance to prove that you're a human being and make this exception." And he said no, that he wouldn't, that this was decided upon by others in the department and that he backed their decision. And so then I went to Burton. That's when I first met Dan Burton. Burton is a congressman.
Congressman Burton. I had worked actually for members of his staff in dealing with the FDA over the years prior to that. But I'd never testified, and I had never worked really closely with Congressman Burton. But at this time, I told his aide that this was the situation, and I asked if Burton would meet with me so that I could come up with a strategy that might put pressure on the agency to let this boy have access to the drugs. And he met with me, and he talked to me about how the FDA commissioner, he would bring him in, and the FDA commissioner would always recite some regulatory impediment to his ability to do something. And anyway, to make a long story short on this, I told him that I knew that, I believe it was Congressman DeFazio had succeeded in convincing the FDA commissioner to reverse a staff decision and allow access to an experimental drug in circumstances not unlike what ours were.
So there was precedent for allowing it to go forward.
And so Burton was interested in that, and so he worked with DeFazio and basically had DeFazio come in at the right time when the FDA commissioner was in his office, in a little bit of a ploy that we pulled off on him. Basically, I told Burton I thought that under examination from him that the FDA commissioner would lie when asked, have you ever allowed a person to gain access to a drug that the staff recommended against? I said, that's going to be his defense. He's going to say, look, we have an oncology staff. They know what's best. I defer to them. I said, what other defense could he have? Yeah. So Burton said, all right, well, let's try that. And so DeFazio was in an anteroom. I believe it was DeFazio, in an anteroom, and was told the story. And so at the right time, Burton asked the question. And of course, true to form, the FDA commissioner said, no, we've not granted an exception. We knew that that was a lie. And then DeFazio comes in and shakes his hand and thanks him for granting the exception to allow the other boy, other child to have access to the drug. And then Burton leaned over and said to him, and now I know you're a liar. And that changed the dynamic. And he said, on your way out, you'll get a subpoena. You'll have to appear before the committee tomorrow. And you'll have to justify to not just the parents of this boy, but the parents of many, why you have denied them access to an experimental drug. So out of this whole thing, the boy was allowed back on the drug. Now, the sad reality is it took us about 28, 30 days to get to this point where the FDA reversed its course.
Makes a difference in these things.
And the tumor had grown so substantially in that interim period that the boy died as he started the treatment. So the FDA killed him. This led me to then write a bill called the Access to Medical Treatment Act, in which for Congressman Ron Paul. And this bill was the precursor to the Right to Try Act. So this is some 15 years or so before his son, Rand Paul, introduced the Right to Try bill in the Senate.
Oh, he was the one who introduced it.
He did. Yeah. And so it was in part, I think principal part, modeled after the Access to Medical Treatment Act, which he renamed the Right to Try bill. And that bill then, as you know, was signed into law by President Trump. So that now allows people with terminal illnesses the right under the statute to have access to an experimental drug.
You know, it's interesting because I have, I may have talked to you about this before, but we lived in England. My wife did part of her medical training in the NHS for a year in the UK. And after coming back, so we learned some of the dynamics there, socialized healthcare and so forth. But after returning, we saw, of course, what was the name of the boy who was terminally ill, had approval for treatment in the United States, but the NHS and the British government basically would not allow the parents to have Charlie Guard. Do you know his situation or his case?
This sounds vaguely familiar.
The treatment had been successful, as I understand it, in a number of cases. It was not covered under, the NHS has limited resources and so forth, but there was a good prospect, as I understand it, of success in treating the boy. But the British government would not allow the boy to leave the country to come to New York, where there were donors ready to provide this free of charge and so forth. It is interesting thinking about that, and I think the motivation, so one would wonder, why would the government be so interested in denying the opportunity for a child, or anybody, really, to seek treatments that could help them? So in that and in this, do you have any ideas about what was behind the resistance?
Protectionism. They wish to protect the drug companies from competition. The government, the FDA, is really a patsy for the drug industry. There have been numerous instances in which whistleblowers have come to Congress, oftentimes before Senator Grassley's committees, and have testified to this corrupt relationship between industry and the FDA, largely the drug industry and the FDA. And there have been numerous instances where emails and other things have been turned over to congressional committees revealing full-scale collusion between drug companies and the FDA. In my book, The Rise of Tyranny, I give numerous examples of FDA collusion. There was a drug, to show you how bad it is, there was a drug called Ketec, which was a super antibiotic, labeled as super antibiotic, one that could kill antibiotic-resistant bugs.
Okay.
And the medical reviewers at the FDA thought that the scientific studies submitted were too pristine, virtually no dropouts or no dropouts, results that were nearly perfect. Atypically...
Meaning it was very effective.
Meaning that it was incredibly effective, more effective than anyone could possibly imagine. So they had their doubts about whether this was a legitimate clinical trial.
Okay.
They even found information that suggested to them that it was fraudulent, and so they contacted the FBI. The FBI performed an investigation and found that, in fact, they had staged all of the clinical trials. They were all bogus, and that the evidence was completely fabricated. Now, this then went to the FDA commissioner. Now, you would expect, of course, that anyone possessed of this information would deny their application.
Right.
Well, that's not what happened. The FDA commissioner granted the Key-Tech application and authorized the drug to enter the marketplace, fully cognizant of the fraud.
That it was fraudulently.
And this is not one instance, but there are many instances.
So did anything, when I assume you weren't the one who brought this to light, but when this information comes forward and it's presented after the fact, is there any recourse? Is there any accountability for people who were key in this process?
Very rarely are these people made to account.
Okay.
And this is true across the board. You know, the opioid epidemic in the United States is largely triggered by virtue of a change authorized by the FDA commissioner in the labeling for Purdue Pharma's OxyContin.
Right.
So the medical reviewers for OxyContin, two of them, were instrumental in influencing the FDA commissioner to change the labeling for OxyContin from acute end-of-life treatment to mild and moderate pain relief. So the labeling was changed, and physicians then all over the country begin to think that this is now available for mild and moderate pain,
and
even lower back pain.
Did they think that, but this was being actively marketed now by the drug companies.
Companies with the green light from the FDA.
And
they recognized no intervention.
Well.
It was addictive,
yes.
And the FDA was actually allowing them to proceed with the statements that, no, it's not addictive. And so, Purdue Pharma made massive amounts of money off of this, and then others, Pfizer and others, came into the market and duplicated, essentially, the marketing approach. All of them were variously aware that this was a fraud, that actually this was highly addictive, and the information's coming back to the FDA, so the FDA is not oblivious to the addictive characteristics, but the FDA started the process. A lot of people think it was started by Purdue Pharma. It was actually started by FDA's change in the labeling and physician change of perspective as a result, that it was available for mild and moderate pain. And those two medical reviewers were then left the FDA and were employed by Purdue Pharma. And this is the kind of corrupt relationship that goes on. But you asked me, and I never answered it, why I'm running. And I'm running for this reason. After I talked to Burton, Burton had me write this book called The Authoritarians, which is a history of the rise of socialism in America.
We'll put these books up on the screen and links at the bottom.
And so in the course of that research, which was intensive, I really discovered more than I had known about the full extent of socialist infiltration of the bureaucracy and of this conscious effort to destroy our republic, beginning with Felix Frankfurter and all these young whippersnappers from Harvard who were far left in the 1930s, actually in the late 1920s and the 1930s, start coming to Washington with the first New Deal, second New Deal. And Frankfurter, as it turns out, was actually a socialist. People, he's a justice of the Supreme Court. He didn't articulate his position as a socialist when he was on the court, but prior to that time, ever since he was a juvenile, he had made clear in his writings that he was enamored by the British labor movement, the British socialist movement, actually established at Harvard the first socialist club, and then recruited from Washington individuals they called Frankfurter's hot dogs, these young whippersnappers, very smart guys, Frankfurter's hot dogs. And they came to Washington and they set up shop in the administrative state and also in other parts of the government. And actually, over time, these individuals were implicated by the Army Signal Corps and by other information, Whittaker Chambers and so forth,
right,
as part of cells that were supplying merit secrets to the communists, to Stalin's henchmen in Moscow.
These were enemies of our nation.
Enemies of our nation, all the way up through into the White House. Information was being supplied about the nuclear weapons program and other things. And also information was being supplied back to them on how to recruit other individuals and to build these socialist enclaves. And that movement towards basically circumventing the constitutional branches of government and putting legislative, executive, and judicial power outside of the constitutional branches into the bureaucracy proceeded apace throughout the first New Deal and the second New Deal, and then all the way through the Great Society and forward, and was actually fed in part by Republicans as well as Democrats. And the result of that was what we have today, which is a disaster of massive government regulation and control over all parts of the market, not least of which now is this huge climate change agenda, which fills the bureaucracy and gives it a new foundation for existence and is resulting in really the destruction of the economic backbone of the economy, the fossil fuel economy.
For abusing the people.
Yes.
Yes. Yep. Well, there are several things. I knew that we would have a great conversation, but there are several things. There are a couple things that I want to hit on based upon what you've mentioned so far. The first is socialism. The second is non-elected people making laws, essentially making laws, and why this is a problem. And, well, there was a third one I want to come back to in a minute. But why is socialism, is it compatible with the United States, with our founding principles?
No, not at all.
And why not? What is it? Because there is a growing number of young people, as you know, today, who, because of the things that you've just described, have become more fond of socialism and see it as a benign at worst and desirable, actually. In fact, very desirable. Why should everybody be concerned about socialism, and why is it not compatible with the United States?
So socialism is at odds with individual liberty. So socialism's...
Why? What do you mean by that? How is it at odds?
Its origin is collectivism, and collectivism does not recognize individual right. Largely Hegelian in origins, Friedrich Hegel was the teacher of Karl Marx, and largely developed the concept.
He was a philosopher.
Hegel was a philosopher. Yep. He was an economist in that sense, also a political philosopher, and he developed the notion of collectivism. So prior to Hegel, the classical liberal concept of individual liberty existed in opposition to the divine right of kings, the notion that monarchs principally could be all-powerful, and that by leave of the crown, individuals had rights, but they had no God-given rights. It was all by leave of the crown. Only the crown, only the king had rights from God. And that was rejected by John Locke in the Second Treatise on Government, and by Algernon Sidney, and virtually all of the major Enlightenment theorists, with some exceptions, were advocates of greater recognition of individual rights. So this opposition to the concept of the king having only rights was what existed in the world at the time Hegel arrives with his new philosophy, which is really not a new philosophy. It's really a throwback to divine right of kings. Yeah. Well, back to Plato too. Yeah. But he thought that individuals did not have rights independent of government, that individuals actually, in an age where there was a burgeoning industrial revolution going on, could only be maximize the benefit of society at large if they were all working under the aegis of experts who could divine what the future should be in a highly complicated world. So you have the agrarian world giving way to the industrial era, and you have all these people migrating from farms and from rural areas into the cities to work in factory jobs and other jobs as the Industrial Revolution takes off. In anticipation of this, Hegel talks about a future world in which government is sort of anthropomorphized. Yes, thank you. And he conceives of the state being a body politic. That's where that term really comes from. And everyone is a participant in the state. All citizens are essentially like cells in the body politic. And so, as such, they must all work in tandem to achieve the objectives of the state, or they will cripple the state, and you will not have the future that is closest to like a nirvana. And so this idea that individuals are servants of the state, that their purpose in their maximum achievement in life is to benefit the state in its progress towards the future, is really a Hegelian concept, which was adopted in the antebellum South, actually, as a defense of the institution of slavery.
We have roads we could go down in that direction, too. Why are those two connected? Why
They're
is the
connected.
antebellum South so fond of this idea?
So Hegel also wrote about slavery.
Yeah.
And he said that actually slavery is not on balance evil. It's actually a good. And the reason he said it was a good, Hegel.
Yeah.
He said that it was a good because it enabled inferior races, so steeped in racism, inferior races to associate with superior races, and while they would live under the control of the superior race, that association would enable them someday to reach beyond their station. This then is adopted by John C. Calhoun and by all the major Confederate leaders and by academics in the South, to say that there is, they referred to a mudsill theory. They said that by virtue of their race, those who are black form a mudsill, a base level, atop which white society can grow. So this was the justification for the idea that the abolitionist argument was, this is anti-Christian.
Yes.
This is against the principles in the
We are all
Declaration of
human
Independence.
beings,
We are all created equal.
Yes.
You are violating your brother Thomas Jefferson's
Yes.
design, which was to recognize that the institution of slavery is evil.
Yeah.
And to say that all men are created equal. And it's also anti-Christian because you're violating these people's right to be free, and free agency is a Christian principle. So all of this comes to the feet of the Confederates, and they have to come up with a new doctrine. So they condemn Thomas Jefferson, they condemn the Declaration of Independence, and they adopt Hegelian collectivism as a justification, and they even refer to slavery. Yancey, I think it was, it's in my book, but I think it's Yancey, refers to the institution of slavery as a fire eater in the South, as the beau ideal of communism. So they laud communism. Well, you're talking about the connection here. What we see then there is actually the same justification for enslaving the public at large.
Yes.
Today, we would all be slaves to the state, right?
And to each other, or to those who would have our wealth redistributed to them and so forth.
Right.
Via the voting booth or however. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's a direct lineage, linkage back to this. And it's all repulsive.
So you're saying that Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are in the same stream of thought all the way back to the Confederacy.
That's right. And Woodrow Wilson, a lot of people, I mean, it really is rather apparent when you look at the history and you look at actually their writings. You can see, for example, Woodrow Wilson repeatedly saying, things that are lauding what are socialist mechanisms, like, for example, the whole idea of eugenics and a master race, his own racism against blacks. Also, his view that Woodrow Wilson, he wrote about the Declaration of Independence that he thought the second paragraph could be eliminated and the value of the Declaration would be the same. He had no appreciation for those four principles in the Declaration of Independence. He wrote his thesis to get his PhD was Hegelian. It was all about basically an organized society in which liberty is not important. In fact, it's against the aims of governance. And so what motivated me to run was the reality that this whole conception of the world had gained ascendancy, and that within the next 2 to 3 years, we may well see ourselves lose fundamentally all of the rights protections that are essential to keep a republic. A republic is predicated on those four concepts in the second paragraph. All men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator, God, not government, with certain unalienable rights, among them the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The very purpose of government is to be instituted among men to protect the rights of the governed. That's the very purpose of a republic. It is to protect our rights. And that governments are based on the consent of the government. Their powers has to be based on the consent of the governed to be legitimate. And this becomes all important because when you change the Constitution, effective, acting, living, working governance of the United States from its constitutional moorings, you unhitch it, and you instead pursue outcomes-based decision-making, like is being done today in the Biden administration.
Yes.
You don't honor the separation of powers, you violate it. You don't honor the non-delegation doctrine,
justifies the means.
Then you have done very much what George Washington warned future generations against when he said, "Let there be no change by usurpation, for though in one instance it may be an instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed."
All throughout history.
All throughout history. Yeah. And this is the struggle. This has always been the struggle in our country. As you know, my book, The Authoritarians, documents, this notion of socialism has been with us really all the way back to its collectivist roots in our country in the antebellum South. And this idea has gained ascendancy, but it has always been one that has been repulsive to our founders and also to everyone who loves liberty. You take people from around the world who've experienced socialism and communism, and you bring them to the United States, very few of them will say that they would prefer to live under socialism or communism than in a free state like our country. And the sad reality is that free state is very much hanging on by a thread. The Constitution is hanging on by a thread. Yeah. And that's what motivates me. I want to save the Republic. I want to save our Constitution. I want to reverse all of the policies of big government. I want to end the administrative state. I want our people and our children, particularly our children, to live in a free country. And I want to do whatever I possibly can to ensure that, so that the blessings of liberty can be passed on to future generations and not lost. I reflect a lot about Reagan's statement. You know, he said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.
Yes. We
did not inherit it in the bloodstream, but it must be fought for, defended, and passed on to future generations, or one day in our sunset years, we will have to say what it was once like to be free in America. Yeah. I don't want that moment to occur when we have to tell our children, you know, I lived in a free country. It's not free anymore. The country you live in is now a state that's dominating every aspect of our lives, and you won't enjoy the freedom to choose what you will do or what you will think or say, but you're going to be told what to do. But, you know, there used to be a time when we had it here in America. No, I think the greatest days for our country have to be ahead of us, and we have to ensure that. We owe it to our children. We owe it to our country to save the Republic from ruin.
You know, my daughter was just writing, I was just read an essay that she's preparing her college applications, and she wrote an article evaluating a speech by Justice Sotomayor. And in this speech, it's interesting, and the reason it caught my attention, and you recalled it my memory just now, is that Sotomayor's speech had a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is that unites us as Americans. She emphasized she brought in the term diversity, of course, which we are a diverse nation. We're people from many different backgrounds, all kinds of people. But her point is that being an American or Americanism doesn't look like one certain set of traditions or cultural backgrounds or whatever, which is very true.
Sure.
But what she missed in all that was what we've been talking about, and that is the common commitment. The motto of our nation from the beginning was a pluribus unum, out of many, one. We're all kinds of different people, but we have, and we must continue to reaffirm these liberties and the limited government, the thing that keeps the monster in the box or on the leash so it doesn't come and consume us all, government being our servant rather than us being subject to the whims of people that we never allowed to have the authority in the first place. And this brings us right back around to the other thing I wanted to talk about, which you mentioned at the beginning. And that is the problem of people who are not elected by us making laws. The Constitution says the legislative power shall be vested in Congress.
Right, exclusively.
And so does Congress have the right to cede that authority to somebody who is a career bureaucrat who's not going to be able to be kicked out by the voters or held accountable in any way?
No. From the founding, James Madison in the Federalist Papers said the combination of any two of these powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in single hands, is the very definition of tyranny.
Right.
They meant for a separation of powers. They also inherited from Locke and very much believed that powers once vested in particular branches that the populace accepts by their consent to the Constitution cannot be altered by taking those powers and removing them from those branches and placing them in independent hands. The very creation of the administrative state was known from the very start to be an unconstitutional enterprise, was known to be aimed at taking the power out of the Constitution's branches and vesting it in unelected hands,
yes,
the effect of which would be to breach the constitutional bonds between the people and the government they consented to and this new state. And that was said to be necessary by people like Frankfurter and others who really didn't believe in the Republic. They said that's necessary for us to adjust to the Industrial Revolution, to adjust to modern circumstances, because they wanted efficiency, which they said the system of checks and balances did not allow. And they also wanted expertise.
Oh, we have that trouble with gridlock in Congress, right?
Yes, and they also wanted what they thought was expertise. This same contagion in favor of so-called experts, which we inherited from Bismarck's Germany.
And these experts, of course, are angels.
Of course they are. Was what really infected this whole notion of the administrative state taking over for the Constitution's branches of government. And that has resulted in some of the greatest tragedies in American history, not least of which is eugenics. So this idea of eugenics, you had this horrible decision by the Supreme Court by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a eugenicist. He believed in eugenics.
He was.
His dad was a physician who believed in eugenics, and he believed in eugenics, and he issued a decision, Buck versus Bell, which he wrote, which was horrendous because it did not find that there was any liberty right violated when they forced Carrie Bell to have fallopian tubes cut. So she was forcibly sterilized under this.
Really?
And he upheld that on the notion that she was an imbecile. And there was no science to support that. She actually wasn't in any way mentally challenged. But they had engineered the case. It was a sham piece of litigation. And he was cognizant of that. He was a participant in it. Went up to the Supreme Court, and he authored this decision. One Catholic justice dissented because of the barbarity of this. But also, this led then to an era of eugenics across the United States. It had become so prolific that the Nazis borrowed from it in creating the final solution.
Borrowed from us.
Borrowed from us.
Wow.
They used the Buck versus Bell case.
I mean, by us, I mean the people who are philosophically
yes,
on the other side of where we stand, right?
And they used Buck versus Bell in the Nuremberg trials as a justification for the final solution.
Wow.
But in any event, this repulsive, really horrific thing where you're forcing people to be sterilized occurred in the United States from about 1907 to 1983.
To 1983.
It was still going on. And
to people who had been institutionalized or whatever?
Yes, but also to those that were just deemed to be on the wrong side of the tracks, because under the theories that existed back then, absolutely unscientific and counter. The idea that somehow, say, if you were a criminal, your offspring would be criminals, and that they should be sterilized to eliminate those that they considered unfit from being in the population. So this horrific practice occurred. Countless people were forced to go through this, over 60,000 actually in the United States. And, this is a result of this thinking that expert knowledge, expert understanding of the world should be compelled, you should be compelled to follow what the experts divine as best for you by force of law. And this mistaken notion, this rejection of individual liberty and freedom of choice is barbaric. It is if you lack that ability to control your own decision making and your own choice of which direction to take in life, you're a slave. You are absolutely
right.
enslaved to the state. And whether the slave owner is an individual or the slave owner is a state, to the individual slave, it's a meaningless distinction except for this fact. You might be able to get away from the slave owner, but you cannot get away from the state.
Yeah.
And if you're going to live in this country, you then are obliged to abide by the law. And if the law is an enemy of the people's liberties, as it is today in many, many respects, you are forced to conform to circumstances that not only hurt you, but also your employees, your family, depriving you of the benefits of your labor.
Yeah.
You know, Thomas Jefferson put it this way. That he defined this as the sum of good government. He said, a wise and frugal government shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. That very simple statement.
Those are biblical principles.
They are.
Yeah.
And that is truly the genius of the American Republic when the Constitution is honored and when the Republic is defended. We have this incredible freedom in this country, which is the envy of the world. And not only that, but when we allow freedom to reign, we find that we are most prosperous. Our greatest periods of development and prosperity follow instances where the government reduces its presence in the market.
There's never been
and we're free.
Like us.
That's right.
Look at what the wealth, and people attribute it to all sorts of terrible things, but really it's because of the freedom that we have had. Right. I want to bring this back because I think we're coming full circle on this. Even at this very moment in the past months and couple of years, we have a situation where the federal government, agencies of the federal government, used the instrumentalities of government, partisans in government have used those to suppress speech on social media, Twitter, whatever.
Yep.
You can see the things that happened with eugenics that you just mentioned. Probably many people, either they did not know that it was happening, or they thought, oh, that's just those people. That'll never happen to me. Is it conceivable that people in our federal government could declare all their political opponents imbeciles and use that as a reason to suppress them or deny their rights?
Well, we're seeing that.
Exactly. Of course, I asked the question because that is exactly what we're seeing. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Twitter files revealed to us the extent of collusion between the White House, the FBI, and CISA. And we saw, for example, that the White House was basically using the FBI and its connections with the media, both directly and through the FBI and through CISA, to engineer a collusion aimed at censorship, censoring political views that were contrary to the administration's positions, principally related to the Hunter Biden laptop. So you have all of this proof of influence peddling and corruption writ large in the Biden family.
Concern for national security and all kinds of other things.
Major. And you have the establishment leadership in the FBI and the White House and in CISA engaging in this effort to deplatform, censor, and dox and otherwise abuse any individual who dared speak against the Biden administration, and also to propound the absolute falsehood that this was Russian misinformation.
Yes.
And then we also have...
And they knew that it was falsehood very early on.
They knew. And just as they knew that the Steele dossier was fabricated out of the Clinton campaign, paid for, they knew immediately at the FBI, not only based on its content, but based on those who had been involved, Steele as well as the association with the Clinton campaign. You see this in the White House transcripts from the Obama White House, where you have the FBI director at the time, as well as Obama and even Vice President Biden, together in meetings at the White House, discussing that the Clinton campaign had engineered this dossier for the purpose of attacking Trump.
Yes.
And they were fully cognizant of its uses and also of its illegitimacy. So yet they went to the FISA courts and professed its legitimacy, swore to it being appropriate affidavit, and obtained warrants for secret wiretapping against Trump and his. So you had the weaponization of government to attack political opponents at a level that has never before been seen in America. This persisted in the Biden White House with this whole emphasis on censoring people who criticize the administration over-influence peddling, and then also to censor any information contrary to the propaganda being used
narrative.
for the COVID-19 vaccination.
Yes, right.
And that is part and parcel of the movement that Fauci created in large measure to both cover up the gain-of-function research that the United States helped orchestrate in our archenemy, Communist China, despite the fact they have an active bioweapons program and would necessarily have that available for bioweapon use. You have this really horrific situation where that information, you've got suppression of information about early treatment being done by them. They censored that information on the web. They censored information that was critical by scientists of the faults associated with the vaccination. And it just went on and on.
Giving credence to these allegations of all scientists agree, when all scientists do not agree. The ones that do not agree simply are just being...
Right, to just propound this narrative. First they told us, their lies that they propounded were incredible, and at the time they were communicated to the public, it was known by key people like Fauci and others to be lies. I say that known in the sense that his own private correspondence revealed his
and you've
doubts.
looked at these things. Yeah.
And we've looked at these things. And I think, for example, he said that at the start of the whole thing, he said, you don't need to wear a mask. And then he said, when it became more prolific,
that book right there. I'm not going to put you on the spot about the book, but I deal with all these things in there.
Yeah.
There was that timeline, and early on he said, you don't need a mask, and then he said, the story changes, and it was used as a tool to
control people.
To control people, but also in the election as well.
It was used in the election, and it was also used to basically influence individuals to be malleable in ways that the state wanted them to be. So when he suddenly starts saying, wear one mask, no, wear two, wear three, this is preposterous scientifically. Scientists, epidemiologists were saying, and some of them that work for my law firm were even saying, hey, look, the analogy here is that a mask is akin to a chain-link fence, and the virus is a nanoparticle, and it's akin to a mosquito. You can't very well stop a mosquito with a chain-link fence. And so they said that's what we're talking about here. It's neither going to prevent someone from getting a disease nor prevent them from transmitting the disease. And they lied about the mask, but they also lied about the vaccine. So they said it really functions not even as a vaccine, to tell you the truth. But if you take the position that it's a vaccine, well, they said that if you get vaccinated, the President of the United States said this, if you get vaccinated, you won't get COVID. Well, of course, people who are vaccinated in large numbers got COVID.
They did, yeah.
It was the third most common adverse effect that Pfizer identified of the vaccine, was that it would lower your immune system function sufficient so you would get the virus. So you have the vaccine actually not being effective against getting the virus. So what is it? And then the next thing was, they said, you won't carry the virus if you're vaccinated. Remember, the president divided us, basically created a new category of deplorables, those who weren't vaccinated. He said those who are vaccinated are protected against COVID-19. Those who aren't are both carriers, and they're spreading it. And so he condemned those.
Now you're dangerous if you have not been vaccinated.
They've weaponized it. And then he further weaponized it with his executive action through the departments to create this notion that everyone in a company of 100 employees or more would have to be vaccinated or tested weekly, or they wouldn't be able to work there. Whole cloth creation and assumption of legislative power by the executive, vastly unconstitutional, and so held by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it was a very reckless time that I think we're going to be discovering things for many years to come. Now, I'm not a doctor. I have a degree in molecular biology, which at least allows me to tell what a man and a woman are, but among other things. But I do believe that I think most people do understand that even if they don't know the technical aspects of it, that there was more going on beneath the surface than we knew. And now that is being borne out in some of the things that you've mentioned. So all of this, I hope our viewers can understand. You are very well read. You know the big picture, why the principles on which our country rests are very important. But to bring it around, we are now in a situation, and we have a Department of Education, which is unconstitutional. Technically, the government does not have the power to come into these areas, and many other agencies, government doing things that it has no authority according to the Constitution to do. And some people, playing devil's advocate, might say, well, it hasn't been that bad. It's kind of worked out okay. It's, or it's just the way it is. It's too big. We can't take it apart. People now have jobs in the government, and, what are you going to do? It's, too big a thing to tackle. What do you say to people who say that this cannot be turned around, and what do you think can be done? You're going to be one senator, hopefully, but
my whole career, people have told me that.
Yeah.
Whenever I would go to battle against the bureaucracy, they would say, there's no chance you can win.
Yeah.
Even the trade press would say, this is an unwinnable case. And, pundits, lawyers would all say that. And then yet, I found a way to win. And the point is that you really have to understand the bureaucracy, and I believe I do.
Because you've been in it
I've been in it. I've studied it. I've fought it over and over again. I've defeated it.
Yeah. You can't fight City Hall, but you're proving that maximum wrong.
Yeah, and I think that to say that it's a foregone conclusion that we have to accept socialism and a destruction of our country and this whole bureaucratic oligarchy as indefinite, I think is terribly naive when you understand how the bureaucracy works, when you actually can defeat it in court, when you appreciate that the court is actually turning in our direction on a lot of these things. We have a case pending now, not me personally, but there's a case pending now before the Supreme Court that calls into question this thing called the Chevron doctrine, which is deference to administrative agencies. We've had a number of Supreme Court decisions.
That needs to be challenged.
That's right. Yeah. We have a number of Supreme Court decisions that have limited power of the administrative state. I think if we get control of the Senate, Republican control of the United States Senate, that I, along with Rand Paul and Mike Lee and these other constitutionalists, can put together an agenda that will restore the Constitution's limits on government power and can ensure that the government is removed from areas such as the Department of Education where it shouldn't be. Obviously, we should close the Department of Education. We should close the Department of Commerce and the Department of Energy. And we should also put back to the states all those functions that have been assumed by the federal government that the founders intended to be left in the states.
Yes.
But on this issue, just to give you one example. So I wrote a bill for Ron Paul called the Congressional Responsibility and Accountability Act. And what this would do, it didn't pass, and I'll reintroduce it. But what this would do is prevent any proposed regulation from having the force of law unless it was passed into law by Congress.
Yeah.
So it brings back the separation of powers like that.
Yeah.
And so agencies...
It's not that you can't have it. It just needs to go through Congress.
It's merely everything the agency does is now a proposal to Congress.
Correct.
Congress can take it up or not, and it gives the elected representatives the power to decide.
That's the way it ought to be.
Now that, in addition, I would sunset all existing regulations.
Good.
Within 3 years of the passage of this bill,
Giving some
unless
time
passed
to catch
into
up
law
with
by
essential
Congress.
ones. Yeah.
And so this is not the complete answer to this problem, but it is a major step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we have to start shutting down agencies and devolving to the states any function that is actually essential for the public to protect us or whatever, and leave it to the states to decide a lot of these questions that the federal government has usurped.
Yes.
I mean, there is no justification whatsoever for the federal government to be telling through Title IX, for example, through the Department of Education. Now they have a proposed rule that will require every facility that receives federal funds, every park, every municipal center, every school, every military reservation, every facility that is used by the public, Social Security Administration, so on, to allow biological males who declare themselves female to enter bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports facilities, sports teams. This is imminent.
That's overreach. That's totally.
We already have that going on in the Loudoun County Public Schools.
I know. We've been together on this issue, dealing with this.
And in the Fairfax County Public Schools.
Right.
And elsewhere in the state. And this is a terrible threat to girls and women. This is putting them in the position of having to accept massive risk of rape and sexual assault, not to mention just sheer embarrassment of having to have their private places opened up to biological males. It's insane, and yet it is the
mere
agenda.
Declaration. Yeah.
Mere declaration. Recognize this is something that didn't go through Congress. This is coming out of the Department of Education. This, again, is an example.
Why didn't it go through Congress?
Exactly.
It wouldn't have passed Congress, right?
And this is the Biden administration's approach.
This is what the administrative state bureaucrats are able to do things that the people would never accept if it was put to their representatives.
That's right. And it happens over and over and over again. I mean, American people are rejecting in droves the notion of having to drive an electric car. But this administration wants to get rid of all fossil fuels and wants to eliminate gas-powered cars. And so this is insane. This is a terrible attempt to deprive you of economically valuable property, to devalue it to zero based on a regulatory agenda that wants you to drive an electric car. Now, most people who have driven an electric car realize its shortcomings. Most people are not wed on this idea that somehow an electric car is nirvana for the future. And very few instances. I mean, they want the whole military to replace tanks with electric vehicles. We can't have this. I mean, it's unreliable.
Well, I'm sure China would like it if we did that.
They would love it. And this is the other part of it. I mean, we've got a compromised president. He received massive amounts of money from the communist Chinese. And here he is in what looks, for all practical purposes, like a massive payback, having the whole country destroy the fossil fuel industry in favor of what? In favor of solar power, solar panels that are made in China, oftentimes by slave labor, and also windmills. The vast majority of these structures are also made in China. And so you end up with basically hundreds of billions of dollars now going from the United States to our arch enemy, fueling their military, fueling their ability to destroy us, because the Biden administration has this ridiculous idea in its head that somehow the solution to all environmental problems lies in these things. You know that solar panels actually pollute in the environment in major ways. Solar panels break all the time.
From the batteries or from because
the panels themselves are filled with contaminants.
I see.
And so you're putting toxic waste into landfills and other places to dispose of them. And with the windmills, they break too. They break down, and you've got all this massive heap of metal that you're putting in.
They're very
large. Also,
large.
Harvesting the rare earth minerals necessary to make these things is also a massive carbon-based pollution issue. The whole idea, natural gas on balance is vastly more efficient, as well as less costly, as well as less environmentally hazardous than all of this. It would take half the United States. If we're to do Biden's program, half of the geography of the United States, literally half of it, would have to be comprised of windmills and solar panels to give us the energy levels that we presently have. That we presently have from the energy grid that's based on fossil fuels. Not only that energy grid that they're attempting to make has to have fossil fuels as a backup because it's entirely unreliable and intermittent. Then, to top it off, the cost of it is as many as 10 times the amount of comparable fuel sources that are fossil fuels. The only way it can be maintained is through massive subsidization. What does that mean? Either massive deficit spending, or that means heavier taxation.
Yes.
So this is a pipe dream. This is absurd. It's not the future. If you allow markets to decide this...
And it's not really about that. It's about power.
It's about power. It's about total control. If you can control the entire energy infrastructure of the United States from the federal government, you can control every business in this country.
I think that we could talk for about 4 more hours. But thank you for taking the time to talk with me. It's great to have you here.
My pleasure.
All the best to you in your campaign. We will be looking on. And
Thank you.
I have publicly endorsed you for Senate. So
and the endorsement's been reciprocal.
It was reciprocal. And now I stepped out of my school board race. So we're hoping for good things next week in the election here in Loudoun County.
We'll pray for that.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll have more conversations. Please, again, do like and subscribe. We will talk to you again soon. Take care.